gender equality, the issue of equal representation of women in diplomacy, it's really not only a women's issue. It's an issue for all of us as human beings. It's a good governance issue, and it's really about how we can, make the best use of our collective resources.
Hello and welcome to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives dedicated to conversations on the evolution of multilateralism. We're bringing you a special episode today in partnership with UN Women to mark the International Day of Women in Diplomacy. I'm your host, Amy Smith, and I'll be speaking with two leading women about research, practice and policy around achieving gender equality in diplomacy and why it matters. Our guests today are Sofia Calltorp and Dr. Sarah Chehab, and we'll begin by talking about the data. We're going to start this conversation with research and what we know about the current state of gender equality in diplomacy. Dr. Sarah Chehab is Senior Research Fellow at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy in Abu Dhabi, and she founded and curates the Academy's Women and Diplomacy Research Program. In addition, she also trains diplomats on the women, peace and security agenda, feminist foreign policy, and contemporary global and economic affairs. Her research interests and publications revolve around gender and diplomacy, feminist foreign policy, and gendered economic development. She is the author and lead researcher of the annual Women in Diplomacy Index, a unique index that tracks the percentage share of women ambassadors around the world. So, Sarah, welcome to the podcast, and please introduce yourself to the audience and tell us briefly about your motivations in founding the Women in Diplomacy program.
Thank you very much, Amy, for having me. It's a pleasure to be speaking on this podcast and to be speaking on this very important issue on a very important day of International Day of Women in Diplomacy. I sort of started this Women in Diplomacy program and the index basically because I noticed how much there is an absence and an underrepresentation of women in diplomacy in general. So at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy, one of our main tasks and one of our main missions is to train incoming diplomats in the UAE. And the majority of our students have always been women. The majority of the people who apply have been women. And if you look at, the diplomatic community in Abu Dhabi, you see that there are just so many women diplomats. But then when you look at the ambassadors, there's a very clear mismatch between the diplomatic corps and the senior diplomats. And I've always been puzzled with that. And this is something that I have observed having worked at the academy for 10 years now. And so this is the first thing that sparked my interest. So, okay, how come there are so many women at the junior and mid-career level, but once you get to the more senior posts, we don't see any? Like most of the ambassadors at events, at the receptions, in our pictures, like they're all men. So where are the women? And so back in 2018, a colleague and I started to talk about this. And so we decided to, we're researchers, we're academics. So we thought, okay, you know what? Let's dig a bit deeper into that and let's actually check how many women ambassadors there are. And so we started tracking the data on women ambassadorships back in 2018, but we started this on a very small scale. And we started this just looking at the countries of the G20. And the research project was well received. And I think it's because no one had done the research yet in the UAE before us. And so year after year, we started to expand our data set and to sort of recruit more research assistants to help us gather the data. And then in 2023, we decided that, this is going to be a global index. We're going to track as many countries as we can. And so now in the last 2 years, the index has been a global one that tracks all UN member states across, their top ambassadorships. So I started doing this index, but there wasn't really a Women in Diplomacy research program dedicated for that. But given the success of the index and the growing interest in it, and the fact that no other academy, diplomatic academy or think tank in the region in the Gulf was actually doing that kind of work, I said to myself, you know what, this could be something worth pursuing. And so I talked to our leadership who have been very, very supportive. And I said, look, I want to do that full time. I want to start a research program that not only publishes this annual index, but also talks about the Women, Peace and Security agenda, that talks about feminist foreign policy, that talks about the underrepresentation of women in different regions of the world and not just the Arab world. And this gave me the green light. And in late 2022 is when I set up the standalone research program. And now I basically do this full time. So this is a little bit of the story. You know, it's a bit of a personal interest of mine, coupled with me realizing that really there's not enough research on this subject and there's nobody paying attention to it. I mean, at least in this part of the world. And so this is how the whole project started.
This is a fantastic expansion, both of the way the index has gone, but also in depth into the substance of it. And you've really picked out the gaps there that you've noticed. So for us, what are the key points that we really need to know about where we stand currently?
Look, I mean, I know that that June 24th is a day when we're celebrating women in diplomacy, but I'm going to have to be a bit pessimistic here and give a glimpse into the grim reality, because where we stand is actually not that great. So what we have found in 2024, but also in 2023, is that the overwhelming majority of ambassadors are men. And when we're talking about an overwhelming majority, we're talking 79 to 80% of ambassadorships worldwide are held by men. And so women are nowhere near an equal representation in the senior or most senior diplomatic posts. And what worries me is not only that this is a massive underrepresentation, but what worries me as well is that progress is very slow. So because we are tracking this data annually, we are not seeing a sort of big jump. And I know that, you know, this is perhaps normal because ambassadorships don't change every year, right? So when an ambassador is appointed, she or he usually stays in the position for a few years. And so this is normal. But we haven't really seen much groundbreaking change. So because we do track, for example, the top 10 countries that have the highest rates of gender equality in diplomacy. And we also have like the lower top 10. And it's always the usual suspects. So for example, for the last few years, Canada has always been at the top. You look at Sweden, you look at Finland, you look at Norway, South Africa. These are always the top performers. And then when you look at the countries that are performing the worst when it comes to appointing women ambassadors, it's also always the same list. And so it's a bit of a grim reality that we're always talking about the same countries. And so where we stand currently is actually not that great because of the fact that we don't have parity in the most senior diplomatic posts. And so that is, of course, you know, a concern. Now, that's not to say that some countries are not doing enough progress, because we know that we have a few success stories of countries that have really improved a lot. As I mentioned when I answered the first question, we've been tracking this data since 2018. And so for a few countries, we do have data for them since 2018 until today. And we can, for example, talk about the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom back in 2018, 28.8% of their ambassadors were women back in 2018. But then if you fast forward to 2024, now 40% of their ambassadors are women. So you can see that for certain countries, including Canada, by the way, in 2018, only 35% of Canadian ambassadors were women. And in 2024, that increased to 53%. And so you can really see that some countries have taken this very seriously, and it's taken a lot of political will and deliberate decision-making within ministries of foreign affairs to increase those percentages. And so there are success stories. There are countries that are really walking the talk, as we say. But if you look at the global picture, there's not much improvement, I would say, globally. You'd really have to dig deeper into these individual cases to track, okay, who are the countries that are making the most efforts and who are basically succeeding. And then you realize that, yes, you have a group of 10 countries that are improving, but then you have a group of 20 countries that have not improved at all in the last few years. And so it's a mixed reality. There's a lot to celebrate. There's a lot to commend. There are a few countries that have really done a great job, but I would say overall, we're very far from achieving parity in the top senior posts.
Well, you've painted a very clear picture, I think, of the state of things across the world, and also highlighted the extent to which this can change.
Yes, it's, as I said, when you look at the past 5 years, you do see an improvement. When you're tracking this data year on year, it could be a bit demotivating and demoralizing because year on year, you don't see that much improvement. But then when you look at the difference between 2018 and 2024, that's when basically you see the bigger jump and the big improvement. But at this rate, it's probably going to take us another 40, 50 years before we see, a substantive difference. I don't know if I'm going to be alive to see it myself. I hope I will be, but it's not happening quickly enough.
Or we can simply accelerate this. So,
yes. Yeah.
I also wondered if there is a difference in percentage of women who are appointed to top diplomatic posts in the multilateral system compared to those appointed to ambassador positions in other contexts.
Right. Yes, there's definitely a difference. Overall, I have to say, when we're looking at international organizations, I was reading a report a few weeks ago that said that women leading international organizations, multilateral organizations, are also a minority. And that's also another concern. When you look at the United Nations institutions and others international organizations, it's the same picture, right? So women are a minority in leadership positions there. But when you look at different spaces, yes, there could be a difference. We have a group, let's say, of a dozen countries that have recently declared a feminist foreign policy. So when you look at that group of countries, let's say, and when you average out their ambassadorships and how many women ambassadors they appoint, obviously as a group, because they've committed to a feminist agenda, their average share of women ambassadorships is at 31% versus the world average of 21%. So you do see a difference. When you look, for example, at the European Union and you look at EU member states, within EU member states, they do as a group, as a bloc, together have a higher share of women ambassadors than the world average. When you look at the G20, when you look at the BRICS, so every sort of different space has its own, I think, result. But I would say overall, it's the same picture. Maybe when you look at certain groups of countries, they're doing better than others, but overall, we don't see equality anywhere. And so there's no multilateral organization or multilateral space that's really created a gender equal playing field for women. It still doesn't exist. Some are doing better than others, but nobody is near parity at the moment.
And where are women ambassadors posted? I was wondering if there's a sort of even geographical distribution, or are there countries that host higher percentages of women ambassadors?
That's a very good question, because this is something that we've actually looked at more in 2024. So from 2018 to 2023, I was not tracking the data on where women ambassadors are posted. It was just too much, and I didn't really have the resources to do it. But in 2024, I actually wanted to see, okay, where are these women posted? Because it's very important to, know how many women ambassadors you have. But it's, I think, an equally important question to ask, okay, where are these women going? Are they going to posts of very high and strategic economic and military significance, or are they being posted in countries that, just to be very diplomatically incorrect, but I would say, countries that are lower on the diplomatic pecking order? And so we looked at where the countries that host the highest number of women ambassadors. And I was quite surprised by what we found, because we found that there were in 2024 a few small countries and small islands where the overwhelming majority of ambassadors were women. So Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Barbados, Mauritius, they have a very high percentage of women ambassadors that are posted there. And so this was interesting to me because I never thought about it myself. But then when you look at it from a regional perspective, the Nordic states stand out, the Scandinavian states stand out as being the group of countries that welcome the highest number of women ambassadors. So Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, these are the countries where you see that as a bloc or as a group, they host the highest share of women ambassadors. But as a group as well, they also send the highest share of women ambassadors. So there's definitely this reciprocity trend that is at play when you're looking at the Nordics as a group. And then when you sort of dig deeper into the data and see, okay, well, we know where they're going, but okay, let's look at the most powerful or countries in the world today. So let's look at how many women ambassadors are posted in the United States or Germany or Canada, the UK, India, China. Let's look at how many ambassadors are posted there. And we looked at the data, and what we found out is that in these important, very strategic, very important states, there's not a lot of women ambassadors posted there. So, for example, 27% of the ambassadors posted in the United States are women. 26% of the ambassadors posted in Germany are women. In Japan, it's as low as 15%. And so we still, when we looked at, let's say, the countries of the G7, when we looked at China, when we looked at India, which are very important economic powerhouses today, what we noticed was the same thing, that these countries do not send a lot of women ambassadors abroad, but they also don't receive a lot of women ambassadors either. And so our data sort of found the same thing that another study had found a couple of years ago, which is that women ambassadors tend to be posted more in countries that have a good level of gender equality, safety, countries where, you want to signal that you agree with their policies on gender equality. So, Norway, Finland, Denmark, these are countries that always have the highest scores when it comes to gender equality in their domestic spheres. And so there's this perception that if you send a woman ambassador to these countries, then you actually are endorsing their domestic policies and you're respecting that, and you know that this is a country that's also going to respect your own ambassador. And what we found out last year in the index actually confirms this finding even further. And just to make a long story short, women ambassadors are posted everywhere, but they're definitely sort of concentrated in regions of the world that encompass the Nordic/Scandinavian states. And then when you look at your most powerful emerging economies, they're a minority. That's basically the conclusion.
So as you said, this reciprocity really comes out in this.
Yeah.
And a lot of things to celebrate, but also a lot of things to work on. I was wondering if there are some other trends that you've found since you started the index.
I mean, what we always noticed is that there's one region in the world, for example, that has consistently had as a region the highest share of women ambassadors, which is Europe. And then at the same time, the Middle East and North Africa has consistently been the region that has the lowest share of women ambassadors. And that is something I think of a missed opportunity because, I am based in the Gulf. We are part of the MENA region, and there's a lot of work to be done, I think, in the Middle East in terms of sort of empowering women to take on these top jobs. And so the results in Europe have always been consistently better than those in the rest of the world, but then the worst performing region has always also been the Middle East and North Africa region. And that is something that is a call to action, to improve those scores in the coming years.
And you've taken up that call.
Yes, I mean, I try. I don't know how successful I am, but I definitely try.
I also saw that you had really highlighted some startling figures about women in mediations and negotiations. And this year is also the 25th anniversary of Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. The agenda encompasses 10 UNSC resolutions that recognize devastating effects of war on women and girls globally, and also demands that these groups are fully engaged in conflict resolution and peace-building efforts from which they've been historically marginalized. So to what extent do you see the lack of women representation in foreign policy as detrimental to peace?
It's very glaring that, not including women, not including women's voices, women's lived experiences, not including women negotiators and community representatives around the table is very detrimental to peace. There's a lot of data out there that's been compiled by, independent experts and scholars and academics, but also by the United Nations that tells you that when women participate in a negotiation, in mediation, in a peace agreement, that peace agreement tends to last longer by 30 years because you have everybody represented and everybody's concerns are echoed and everybody's needs are sort of met. And when you don't do that, when you don't include women, that's when your peace is not really sustainable on the long run. So we know that there's a lot to be gained from including women in any sort of peace and security issue. Unfortunately, again here, this has not been very consistent. So since the year 2000 and since the Women, Peace and Security agenda has started, we've seen more movement in that. And we've seen great efforts by the United Nations at, always including gender advisors in their peacekeeping missions, always making sure that women are included as negotiators and mediators, supporting efforts in a lot of countries, such as Syria, for example, to form boards with women that participate in official negotiations. We've seen a lot of improvements at the track 2 level, so the community level in peacekeeping. And there's been a lot of focus on women's activism and the important role that they play at the track 2 level. But somehow we have still not managed to translate these gains that are happening within communities to the formal negotiation level. And I'm not sure that the Women, Peace and Security agenda, after 25 years of being, in existence, if it has developed tools to actually tell us, okay, how do we take the gains that we're making at the community level and how do we translate them and how do we echo them in the more formal negotiation and mediation circles? And it still hasn't. So it's sort of a missed opportunity. And I think that, yes, we're celebrating 25 years of the WPS agenda, but it's also unfortunate that this is happening at a time when there's so much backlash against anything related to gender and equality and inclusion, and the multilateral space is not really taking on those issues as much as they used to before. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think that it's a year where anyone who's involved in the WPS space needs to sort of look inwards and say, okay, we know that there's a lot of progress that's been made, but how do we go from here? How do we adapt the Women, Peace and Security agenda to meet our needs? And here I hope that I can have a couple of minutes to highlight that the Arab region has sort of taken up that call. And last year, there's a sort of consortium of organizations of which we are part of that said, okay, you know what? We're not going to wait for anybody to tell us how to make the WPS agenda work. We're just going to form a working group for Arab states. We're going to meet regularly and we're going to put together document and white paper that's going to highlight how exactly the WPS agenda has worked in the Arab region, how it has failed in the Arab region, and how we can improve it to make it work in the Arab region for the Arab region. And we've been very active at doing that. So the working group has so far met 3 times. We're meeting at the end of June actually on June 24th for the fourth time. And then we're meeting again in September ahead of the 25th anniversary of the agenda in October to sort of say, okay, look, as a group, this is what Arab states believe that the WPS agenda should do for the next 25 years in order to make it better and make the agenda work. And it's really simple findings. For example, just translating the agenda, the technical terms in the agenda to Arabic. When you want to go into a community and talk to women about the WPS agenda, you can use words like gender, like empowerment, like very technical terms that someone that you're talking to is simply not going to understand what you mean. And certain words actually don't have an equivalent in the Arabic language. And so things like adapting the language of the agenda and sort of twisting it a little bit to fit a regional context, localizing it, mainstreaming it, this is very important. And it hasn't been done. Another finding, for example, the WPS agenda doesn't talk at all about the situation of women who live under occupation. And since October 2023, I think we've all witnessed the detrimental effects of what a political and military occupation can do to women. And if you look at the situation in Gaza right now, women and children are, at the front lines of the war when it comes to being victims. And so the WPS agenda does not address the concerns of women who live under occupation. If you look at Ukraine, same thing. How do we, for example, understand or evaluate how Ukrainian women are dealing right now with the war? So there's a lot of, I think, work that needs still to be done with the WPS agenda to sort of make it work better in certain contexts. And obviously, we'd have to work really hard to make those changes and to adapt those changes at a time when it looks like the whole multilateral global system is actually against all of these issues. So it's not easy, and it's not going to be an easy mission. But hopefully we'll get there this year.
I think that's a very positive statement. I was going to ask you to end on a high note about gains and stability and the way that we can help and when women engage in peace and security issues. But I think you've just shown us a very practical way forward.
Yeah. So, I think that momentum exists, motivation exists. We just need to get more organized, I think, and to sort of keep talking about it. And I think localizing these issues and bringing them into our own communities, translating what they mean into our own languages and experiences can really help. And I'm very, glad to see that at least in this part of the world, this has begun and this is already happening. And I hope that in 2026 onwards, we can sort of have these sorts of exchanges across regions, across countries, and to sort of learn from each other. I think this is definitely, it can go a long way.
That's wonderful. Dr. Chehab, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much, Amy, for having me.
Our second guest today is Sofia Calltorp. Ms. Calltorp is Director of UN Women in Geneva and UN Women's Chief of Humanitarian Action. She has over 25 years of experience working in diplomacy, humanitarian affairs, human rights and development across different regions and organizations. And prior to joining UN Women, Ms. Calltorp served as ambassador and special envoy of the Swedish government for gender issues. She has also served as Sweden's ambassador to Zimbabwe. So, Sofia, welcome very much to the podcast, and please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your role in UN Women and your collaboration with women in diplomacy.
Thank you, Amy. It's really a great pleasure to be here today on the podcast and, of course, joining you all in observing the International Day of Women in Diplomacy. I actually started off as a young intern here in Geneva almost 30 years ago within the Swedish mission, and I have since, as you mentioned, served in various capacities, always working on development, humanitarian and gender issues. So now, as Director of UN Women here in Geneva and Chief of our humanitarian action. I oversee our global humanitarian engagement, but also very much our support to member states and other Geneva-based partners in terms of advanced gender equality and women's empowerment in all spheres of life. And here, of course, women in diplomacy is key, and it falls within our broader work on gender-responsive foreign policies, where we really see, pushing for gender equality in diplomacy is pushing for gender-responsive foreign policies, ultimately leading to a more just, non-discriminatory world. So, very briefly, in this work, we support member states on 3 key areas. First is about gender data, evidence and knowledge, really helping to bridge that gap. What does the situation look like, and what can be done in terms of increased gender-responsive foreign policy action? And then secondly, which is of course very basic, but still an issue where we have a long way to go, that's in terms of equal representation, to simply make sure, I use the word simply because it should be simple, to make sure that women in all their diversity are equally represented along various tracks of diplomacy. But of course, that is not the case. So this is an area where we also work with member states, and very much showcasing the added, that gender-responsive foreign policies and women in diplomacy, it's not only the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, because it do lead to better outcomes. Then third is working with gender mainstreaming across different areas of foreign policy. And this I think is really interesting, because very often people do not see the value of adding a gender lens to issues such as trade, diplomacy, migration and other spheres. So what we're trying to do is to really showcase the value added and the case for making sure that those policy areas are gender responsive. Often we think of those as gender neutral, but in fact they are disproportionately disadvantaged towards women. So that's our 3 basic areas of work. And of course we work very closely with member states, with all international agencies, civil society and partners here in Geneva. And of course, last but not least, we also support, of course, women diplomats through formal and informal networks. And really try to add value as we can in this extremely important area of work.
Thank you. I really love your comment that this is the smart thing to do. So, we also have an anniversary. 2025 is the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And women diplomats, through their participation in Beijing conference, help solidify the idea that a gender perspective is not just a women's issue, but a fundamental component of effective diplomacy and international relations, as you said, the smart thing to do. They argued for the mainstreaming of gender into all policy areas, from economic development to peace and security. Could you tell us, though, now, standing at this 30th anniversary, where are we with the implementation on the Platform for Action?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that the value of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, it really cannot be understated. It's such a visionary, transformative shift in how to look at women in public life and the importance of a gender equal society to achieve our broader goals. So it really remains one of the most comprehensive and transformative global agendas for the advancement of women and girls. And at this stage, as you said, when we celebrate 30 years of the Declaration and Platform for Action, really look into what has done, but also what remains to be done. And I think it's worth noting that in those 30 years of implementation, actually 90% of all states have taken measures to eliminate violence against women, and 79% have reinforced social protection measures. And we also have seen an increase in women's political participation and education. So I think it's important to recognize that there have been substantive progress, but also a lot remains to be done. And in celebrating the 30th anniversary, we published earlier this year the SG's report on the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, a comprehensive report where we looked at this, and we can see that economic injustice, the climate crisis, and the escalating conflict that we see around the world are deepening inequalities, and that women and girls are disproportionately affected facing exclusion, violence, and a significant backlash against their rights. So although we have seen progress, there is so much that remains to be done. Just to mention a few issues that we highlight in this report. A key issue is the gender pay gap that persists, that women continue to earn less than men. We also see a stagnation in maternal mortality rates that where we have seen a lot of progress over the decades, we now see a stagnation in maternal mortality rates. And we also, as a fact, can see that 400 million women and girls continue to live in extreme poverty. So still a lot of work to be done. In terms of representation in public life, we know that as of January 2025, we have 28 women serving as head of states or government. And we have 18% of ministers of foreign affairs led by women. So in terms of, women taking up diplomatic roles that shape critical foreign policy issues, those low levels of numbers in terms of high representation of women in public life across countries is a challenge that we need to continue to really focus and work on.
So a lot of work still to be done, but we will put the link to the report in the notes for this episode. The Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, this year had its 69th session and adopted a political declaration. We started this episode with a discussion on data around women in diplomacy, and you've just given us some figures on that. I was glad to note that the declaration calls for a strengthening of the capacity of national statistical offices and research organisations to collect and produce and use gender statistics and disaggregated data ethically, which is an important point. What else would you like to highlight here about the political declaration?
Thank you, Amy. I mean, the point on data is crucial because obviously we need to have the data in order to take action where it matters the most. So that's something also that we were very pleased to see. I mean, obviously in the overarching global landscape that we see, that the declaration reaffirmed that we here at the UN remain a vital forum for building consensus on gender equality was for us important, that it underscores the urgency of advancing this agenda. It also represent quite a significant step forward in reaffirming and advancing the global commitments to gender equality and women's empowerment. And as we have heard, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action remain the basis. But with this political declaration, we could also see some strengthened language in terms of human rights, health, and on eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls. We also saw a strong commitment throughout this declaration to the women, peace and security agenda, which is, of course, key given the rise of conflicts that we see globally. And it also emphasizes the importance of looking into digital transformation and how we can close the gender-digital divide. That's really an arena where I think we need to do so much more in making sure that digitalization is not advancing or exacerbating gender inequalities, but really the opposite. But that is an arena where we really need to join forces and work together. And here in Geneva, we have ITU, who's been doing a lot of work on that. And for us as UN Women to see how we can work within and with partners of the UN, but also in civil society and member states. That's really key.
You've outlined some very good commitments and ways forward there. But I wondered, as we close this episode, what message you'd like to leave for our listeners?
I mean, for me, gender equality, the issue of equal representation of women in diplomacy, it's really not only a women's issue. It's an issue for all of us as human beings. It's a good governance issue, and it's really about how we can, make the best use of our collective resources. And I really would like to stress that gender equality, it's the way forward if we want to achieve our sustainable development goals and if we want to make progress, because women bring different experiences, they ask different questions, and they broke inclusive, sustainable solutions. All data and research shows that. So for me, this International Day of Women in Diplomacy, it's really a powerful reminder of our collective responsibility, women and men alike, to actively promote equal opportunities for women at all levels of diplomatic service and make sure that we together move forward. And just as we close and sitting here in this wonderful library of the Palais des Nations, I think, let's also draw inspiration from the women that have paved the way and commit to build a future where diplomacy truly reflects the diversity of the world. And we have a lot of good and inspiring examples through history, but also in the diplomatic world of today. So happy to be part of this conversation and continue to be part of this important work ahead.
Thank you so much, Sofia Calltorp, for joining us and for leaving this message of gender equality. We can't but agree with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.